Hi, everybody. It is right at 12 o'clock, and we are really excited here at CASE to kick off this session for you today, hosted with Illuma. And Stephanie Jones is your speaker, and I'm going to let her introduce herself and kick us off. Take it away,
All
Stephanie.
right. I'm giving we're still loading in, so I'm going to introduce myself for a second so we can get all of the participants in, and then we'll jump right into behavioral intervention plans. We're going to talk about legal compliance today, but mostly we're going to talk about where the gaps are and how do we close these gaps, and hopefully we're going to have some really practical discussions about those kinds of things. My name is Stephanie Jones. I am a partner with the law firm F3. We are Fagan, Friedman, and Fullfrost. We are a nationwide school law specific firm. I am located out of Chicago and our Chicago office, but we have offices in Chicago, Southern Illinois, Missouri, Iowa, California, and Washington State. So I'm excited to be here with all of you guys today. I specialize in special education law, but more recently, I specialize in being the mom to a 7-year-old autistic my son, who's 7 years old and has autism. So I have a whole new perspective and look at behavioral intervention plans as I look at them from the perspective of a parent and a child with special education and behavioral needs. So we'll talk a lot about that today. And I use Larry, my son's name is Larry. I use Larry as a lot of examples. So I'm going to apologize in advance if you get sick of me talking about my 7-year-old, but I think those real world examples are the best way to help us identify those gaps and be able to fix them. And I'm finally seeing the attendee numbers kind of slow down a little bit. So I'm going to just jump right in with behavioral intervention plans. So, why do these things matter? I think behavioral intervention plans and understanding their foundational importance is important. I think behavioral, talking about FBAs and BIPs matter because it's legal issues, it's access to FAPE, it's improved educational outcomes, it's decreased disciplinary removals, it's increased participation in instruction, it's all of these compliance risk assessment needs. But let's talk about really why a solid BIP matters, because it makes a classroom run better. So having a behavioral intervention plan that makes sense for your classroom is going to make classroom management easier for whoever is in charge. And so, all of these things matter. The FAPE matters, the educational outcomes matter. But at the end of the day, having a solid BIP in place that can be put in place is going to make it better for your teachers. And if our teachers are more comfortable in the classroom, if they can manage the classroom better, all of these things are going to fall into place. And so having a solid BIP really is about supporting our staff to support our kids. So let's talk about how we make sure we do that. Legal foundations in terms of a BIP are IDEA requirements. We must address a student's behavior when it impedes a student's learning or when it impedes the learning of others. Obviously, we have those things. IEP teams have to consider the use of positive behavioral interventions and supports before they jump into to behavioral interventions that may not be positive or may be more punitive. That's what the law says. This is how I try to contextualize that. When we are intervening with behavior, we want something that is going to change behavior. We want to see those positive impacts on behavior in a classroom. There's not a lot of data that supports that a suspension or an expulsion from school actually changes behavior. It changes the classroom dynamic for sure. We're removing that child from the environment, but there's not real data that shows that it changes behavior. There's a lot of research and data that supports that positive behavioral interventions and positive behavioral supports can change behavior. And so when we look at IDEA, the law, we're required to use these positive behavioral interventions, but why are we doing it? We are doing it because those are the interventions that data shows support behavioral changes. And so we want to make sure that we're using those things that create behavioral changes. When is a BIP required? I realize, and by the way, I realize I'm going through some of these legal slides quickly. I think I want to go through the legal slides because you guys have the legal context, but it's hard to talk about those behavioral interventions, in context without talking about the legal stuff first. So that's why I'm going through this quickly, and then we'll get to the meatier kind of how we dive into things. So IDEA does not require a behavioral intervention plan in every case. We require it when behavior interferes with learning. We require it when we are addressing a manifestation determination. We require it when we talk about an FBA recommendation. We require it following some disciplinary removals. So if we're talking about removals for beyond your 10 consecutive or cumulative days, we're requiring, that a BIP is either in place or reviewed and revised. State regulations can require BIPs in other instances. So you have to make sure that you know your state requirements. And then a lot of times our due process settlements are going to require a behavioral intervention plan. The reality is this: if behavior is significant, a BIP is required. And when I say if behavior is significant, I'm not just talking about behavior that is explosive, behavior that is disruptive, but we can have behavior that, like we can have a kid that has extreme school anxiety, and trying to get that kid in school, in the building, is a real challenge. If that's the case, then a BIP is going to be required. We have to put something in place that's going to set out our plan for how we are going to incorporate a student into school. So, when we talk about the foundations of a good BIP, we're going to identify target behavior, we're going to identify antecedents, we're going to identify consequences, and we're going to identify the function. So, when we talk about the foundation of a BIP as the FBA. So your FBA should identify these things. I think there are mistakes that are made with FBAs all the time. One of the biggest mistakes with an FBA is that we identify only one target behavior. We say, okay, this kid's target behavior is escape, and so we only focus on escape. But their target behavior may be escape and attention. And so if we're not addressing the attention piece of the escape, then we're not going to have a BIP in place that actually addresses the whole picture of target behavior. So I think our FBAs should be broad enough that we're looking at what target behaviors are involved, what are the triggers for that target behavior, what are the consequences for that target behavior. And when I'm talking about consequences here, I'm not talking about penalties, right? I'm talking about what happens after the target behavior and what's the function. So that's where our FBA should sit. Common functions of behavior: escape, attention, tangible gains, sensory needs. These are not the only functions. I use this a lot. I use this acronym a lot with my gen ed teachers because they don't really think about functions of behavior. And so I try to frame it, and I do a lot of discussions about let's reframe where our behavior is in a classroom. You have an ADHD kiddo that is, tapping their pencil, right? I'm picking up a plastic knife because that's what's on my desk. They're doing this, and hopefully you guys can hear the tapping. What is the function of that behavior? We have an ADHD kid. They're tapping, they're fidgeting, all of those kinds of things. The function of their behavior right there may be something sensory. A lot of times those behaviors, when we're talking about an ADHD kid, that they're not trying to be annoying, although a lot of teachers are going to say they know that they shouldn't be doing that. I've told them that they shouldn't do that. They're not trying to be annoying. They're likely looking for some sort of input. And so if we can address that sensory need, they'll stop the tapping. And the sensory need may be that they're just jittery at that point in time. They need some bigger movement. They need some bigger input. It may be something smaller, that they need some sort of physical movement in order to concentrate. And so instead of tapping, we teach them how to doodle. We teach them how to use a fidget that's quieter in order to replace that behavior. So I try to explain that when I'm talking to gen ed teachers about these common functions, because I think that they miss that so often. And the more we're trying to push these kids into gen ed, the more conflict we're getting with gen ed teachers who are saying they can't be here because their tapping is disruptive, their fidgeting is disruptive, their need to get up and move around is disruptive, their behavior is disruptive. So trying to address those kinds of things to make sure that our gen ed teachers really understand that there's a function to students' behavior. We say a lot that all behavior is communication, right? We say that a lot in our special ed world. That's true. I get a lot of eye rolls from my gen ed teachers when I say all behavior is communication. What's it communicating to you? But when I do say that all behavior serves a function, it tends to kind of get more traction. And when they understand what that function might be, what they're trying to get out of their behavior, sometimes we can get through to some positive or other behavioral intervention approaches other than just sending the kid out of the room because they're driving a teacher crazy. Um, Now, I use the EAT acronym, and I've actually recently seen this kind of mixed up. I've seen it as SEAT as well instead of EATs, but sensory, escape, attention, tangible gains instead of escape, attention, tangible gains, sensory. I think this is a good way for people to remember the basic ones: escape, attention, tangible gain, sensory needs. It gives you that really good foundation. Um, so why do our behavioral intervention plans result in disputes? And this is where I want to start talking about where our gaps are. So our behavioral intervention plans end up in disputes for a number of reasons. I think the first reason is that we create a behavioral intervention plan that is not connected to an FBA. So we have a BIP, we have these interventions in place that are, standard interventions that we do in different behavioral systems, but we're not looking at the FBA data to choose those interventions. So we are putting an intervention in place for a student with escape behavior. And we have all of this data related to a student who escapes or who's running. Let's take a runner. But the behavior is reinforcing their need to run. So, or the behavior intervention plan reinforces their need to run. So we're not doing things that effectively stop the running. And that would tell me, like when I see that kind of behavior, that would tell me that we're not looking at the FBA data well enough to connect the BIP to the reasons the child's running. So let's talk about a Larry example. When Larry started kindergarten, Larry ran for the first 7 weeks of school, almost every day. I'm not going to get into how me as a special education attorney had a kid that ran every day for the first 7 weeks of school and didn't know about it early enough to intervene, because that's a whole nother story. But let's talk about the fact that Larry ran for the first 7 weeks of school. He didn't have a BIP at the time. He went into kindergarten with an IEP that was heavy in speech because he was speech delayed. He's now has an autism diagnosis. We hadn't put it all together at that point. He's kind of and I need speech sometimes. Enigmatic, I can't say that word, but you guys know he's a unique profile. Let's say it that way. But when I look at the behavioral interventions that we were using, he was escaping likely because of his communications needs. He didn't understand what was going on in the classroom. He would get overwhelmed and he would run. But the way that the school was addressing it wasn't stopping him. They were keeping him safe while he was running. So it became this game where he was walking around the school. Well, it kind of morphed in that time into becoming an attention piece because he was getting so much attention from his escape behavior that even when he didn't want to run from the classroom, even when he had settled into the classroom expectations, when he wanted that attention piece, he would continue to run. The BIP that we ultimately wrote, or that initially was written for him, really just addressed the escape behavior and it didn't address the attention piece. And so when we were putting that BIP in place, what happened next is the BIP stopped the running, but it didn't stop the function of that attention. And so what we got out of that was additional behavior. He would do things like curse or get aggressive. Well, those behaviors got him the attention that he needed, and the BIP never connected to that. So we had problems with that. And it wasn't until we connected the BIP to both the escape and the attention that we finally got a BIP that worked for Larry. So we have to make sure that the BIP is connected to the FBA, the BIP is connected to those target behaviors. Second big mistake we make, we don't assign responsibility for implementation. I think here are some different things that happen in an IEP meeting. We develop a BIP that could be a really strong BIP. It might be a really complicated BIP. And we identify the gen ed teacher or the paraprofessional to implement the BIP, and they're not in the meeting. At that particular IEP meeting, we've got the PE teacher. I don't know why, but we pull PE and social studies teachers a lot to be the gen ed teachers, but we don't have their regular classroom teacher. And we don't have the paraprofessional in the meeting. So we're assigning them responsibilities for implementing the BIP, but we actually never explain to them what their responsibilities are. So they may be assigned it, they are never taught it. Or we put in that we're going to have responsibilities for this BIP, and we just put special education staff, like staff generally. And we don't say, okay, the social worker is going to do this part of the BIP, the paraprofessional is going to do this part of the BIP, the gen ed teacher is going to do this part of the BIP. Or this person's going to collect the data, this person's going to implement the crisis plan. We don't put that in place. And then we don't train the people to do what they need to do. Right there, that's going to be a BIP failure. And we have to make sure that we are careful about making sure that we assign that responsibility. Third area where we run into problems. We focus on reducing the behavior instead of building a skill. So we write a behavior goal. And by the way, I'm not sure I say this on any of my slides. We'll find out when I get through my slides. But if you have a BIP in place, if we have a behavioral intervention plan in place, and we've done an FBA, you should have a behavioral goal. That's just bottom line, best practice. If you have a BIP, you should have a behavioral goal. But we find that the behavioral goal is, Larry will reduce his behavior by 80%, right? My very favorite behavioral goal ever comes from an attorney named Jay Craning, who's now a retired attorney. You may have seen him speak before. He has made his rounds. He now works as a mediator in Illinois for special education cases. But he trained me a lot, and he used to work in Chicago public schools. And he talked about walking into a manifestation determination one time in CPS where a student, the manifestation or the student's behavior, and make sure you're sitting down for this. The student's behavior was having sex with her boyfriend in the hallway. And so the discussion was, is having sex with your boyfriend in the hallway a manifestation of your disability? She was an ED kid, and they came up with, yes, it's a manifestation of her disability. She was having difficulty determining right from wrong and all of those ED qualifications. And so they decided to write a behavioral goal. And the behavioral goal was that the student shall not have sex with her boyfriend in the hallway 80% of the time. So you're reducing the behavior now. Laugh about the goal. I mean, let's laugh about the goal for a minute. But in that regard, we're talking about reducing the behavior, right? And I can talk about all the other problems with that goal, like sex with her boyfriend in the hallway 80% of the time. How is that measurable? What happens if she has sex with somebody else? What happens if it's in the janitor's closet? Like there's all sorts of problems with that goal. But the biggest problem with that goal is it just focused on reducing the behavior and didn't talk about building the skill that the student was missing. So yeah, she had sex with her boyfriend in the hallway. None of us want that to happen in school, right? But what is the skill that she was missing that made her think that that was okay to do? Like that is a good judgment skill, or that is being in the right place at the right time skill, or what is the skill that she needs to build that would be better related to a behavioral intervention plan than the behavior that we want to reduce, but we're not going to reduce unless we build the skill. So I'll give you another example that is not quite as salacious. I have on my caseload right now, I have an autistic student who is very afraid for some reason, and this is very particularized. He is very afraid of bathrooms that have fire alarms in them. He doesn't like fire alarms to begin with, but I think he had a bad experience at one point in time where a fire alarm went off when he was in the bathroom, and now has this fear of going in the bathroom where there's a fire alarm. And his mom wants a goal for him to reduce the amount of fear or reduce his avoidance of using bathrooms where there are fire alarms in them. Because believe it or not, there's a lot of fire alarms in bathrooms, in school buildings in particular, but just across the board. And so she proposed a goal that was, let's reduce this behavior. Well, the student has a lot of other avoidant type behavior. He actually has a lot of behavior around going to the bathroom in general. So let's, instead of, reducing his fear of fire alarms in the bathroom, which is reducing the behavior, let's build the skill that he can tolerate. He can tolerate issues in a bathroom environment or in unknown environments that may be adversive to him. And let's build the coping skills around how does he cope when he walks in a bathroom and he sees this fire alarm on the wall? How does he cope with that to still be able to use the bathroom and be able to address his basic needs? So building that kind of goal on the BIP, but also building that kind of BIP that we're building a skill instead of reducing a behavior is important. Next issue, BIPs are not reviewed. I think this is a big issue. We have a student that, we get into the annual review and we haven't seen a lot of behaviors. And so we say, oh, the BIP must be fine. We're not going to review it. But at the end of the day, the student then does have a behavior and we get to the BIP and we realize that the BIP is not age appropriate anymore. It was built when the student was in 4th grade and now the student is in 6th grade. And so the behavioral intervention plan is not going to work for the student. Those are the types of things that we see that create disputes. Your interventions are too generic. Putting something that's in place that we do for everybody, or that would be in place for every student, would create problems. Vague behavioral descriptions, like just generally saying the student elopes. Well, when does the student elope? How does the student elope? What happens when the student elopes? What happens after the student elopes? That is all problematic. Missing baseline data. So how often does the student elope? Like the student is eloping every day, all day long, or the student elopes once or twice a week. Like that baseline data is really important. And then having a plan for monitoring the progress. And the piece with having a plan for monitoring the progress, it's not just about writing down data, but it's having a plan for shifting your focus when the progress monitoring data demonstrates that the BIP is not working. Because that happens a lot. And that's not a failure of staff. Like I think that I have teams a lot that are afraid to say this BIP is not working. They're afraid to say that because they feel like that's a FAPE violation. That's going to come up as this BIP is not working, you're doing something wrong, school district. But that's not the case. Kids change, interventions change. Sometimes interventions work in the beginning and they become less effective. We create a problem for ourselves if we're monitoring data and we're not looking at the data for what it means and whether or not the interventions work. If the interventions don't work, that's not a failure on our part. A lot of times interventions are based on hypothesis. Hypotheses are not perfect. They're not perfect solutions to every problem. Where we have a problem is when we don't shift gears. When we don't say, okay, this intervention is not working, we're going to meet 3 months in or 6 months in instead of waiting till an annual review to meet and say, oh, this student's not meeting his goals. That's when we have a FAPE problem. We should be looking at our data on a regular basis, being prepared to move and shift so that we're ready for things like that. Keep in mind, when we're talking about discipline and we're talking about a behavior being a manifestation of a disability, we're required to do this. So when I talk about conducting an FBA, implementing a BIP, or reviewing and modifying a BIP, and we look at that monitoring piece, we are required to do that when behavior is a manifestation of a student's disability. If we're seeing that behavior build up, so we get that 10 days of suspension, right? And we're seeing that behavior build up and we're at 5 or 6 days of suspension and it's all for the same type of behavior. Maybe we should be looking then at whether or not our interventions are working before we get to the 10th day of suspension and we're reviewing our BIP. Because at that point, then suspensions are going to be more difficult to use. And so we're going to have to review a BIP and review the manifestations of behavior every single time after that 10th day. So maybe when we're getting halfway through those days, we should be looking at how are we implementing our BIP? Are we doing it with fidelity? Are we appropriately monitoring our behavior? Are we shifting gears when we need to shift gears? Do we have the function of the behavior down correctly? All of those kinds of things should be part of a conversation as we're seeing a student's behavior escalate. Implementation of the BIP matters. So a hearing officer is going to look at how a BIP's written. They're going to look at how we have identified responsibilities. They're going to look at whether or not we've been consistent with our interventions. They're going to say, how did we do all of these things? How did we implement? The procedural errors are less important. Procedural errors under the 2002 iteration of IDEA that we've been working under for the last 22 years. Procedural errors are only a violation of FAPE if they interfere with the student or parent's right to participate in their education. So really, those procedural errors are minimally impactful. The errors in implementation are what become FAPE violations. And we have to make sure that our BIP is being implemented with fidelity. We have to make sure that staff know their responsibilities. We have to make sure that our interventions were used consistently in order to know that we're not going to have an adverse hearing officer decision. Those are the things that really matter in implementation. And so when we get to due process, or when I'm getting to the point that I'm preparing for a due process for a client, I'm sitting down with the client and I'm saying, how was the BIP implemented? Where are your logs of how you implemented your interventions? Where are your logs of how you discussed and trained your staff on implementation? Where is your documentation on the fidelity of interventions? So if you had a student whose behavior was escalating, was there a supervisor coming into the classroom and giving feedback to the gen ed teacher, the special ed teacher, the parapro about how they're implementing their interventions? Because all of that information is going to tell me whether or not I can win the case, or we need to settle the case in some way, because we're going to get an adverse hearing officer decision. And remember that those adverse hearing officer decisions often result in us paying attorney's fees to the parent. And we want to avoid that as well, because attorney's fees to a parent only take away from your resources to support other kids. And so we'd rather pay them in services. That's always my philosophy. Let's pay them in services instead of paying somebody else's attorney. Documentation does matter. So trying to document these things is important. We want to make sure that we keep those things like training records. We want to make sure that we have data collection forms. We want to make sure that we have progress reports. We want to make sure that we have meeting notes. We want to make sure we have fidelity checklists. I did this presentation on FBAs and BIPs with a BCBA last week, and we talked a lot about implementation of behavioral intervention plans. She does a lot of fidelity checking on behavioral intervention implementation. And one of the things that she talked about using for data collection forms, progress reports, all of those things is a really solid Google form. Now you have to make sure that you're using a Google form that is compliant with your data privacy and security requirements. But if you're using a Google form, it makes a really great graph. And one of my partners, who you're going to hear from in a month if you sign up for the next eLuma presentation, and Ash will get on and tell you a little bit about that in just a second. My partner, Cassie Black, always says that when you're thinking about measurability, when you're thinking about whether or not we have a measurable goal, you're thinking about how we're going to measure data, it's measurable if you can graph it. So keep that in mind, that there are easy ways to take this data. And I think the data collection can become overwhelming. So finding those tools that make it easy to collect the data, easy to demonstrate progress, easy to show parents what's working and what's not working, is a really important way to make this more efficient for your practitioners out there. So here's our little checklist, and I think I'm right on time, so that's great. It's 12:28. Here's our little BIP checklist. Was your behavior clearly defined? Did we identify the function? And did we identify all the functions, not just one target behavior? There may be multiple, and that's okay. You can have more than one target behavior. Have you linked the behavior to the FBA? Have you linked the BIP to the FBA? Are you teaching replacement behavior as opposed to just decreasing the behavior that we don't want? Have we established data collection criteria? Have we assigned our staff responsibilities and trained them in what they need to be doing? Have we set a schedule to review our data and identify whether or not things are working? And how have we included and informed parents in the process? So all of this is important and key to a quality behavioral intervention plan. Legal compliance is always important. It's always what we want, but that's not the ultimate goal. Our ultimate goal is student outcomes. And I think that when we talk about FBAs and BIPs, what we want is we want to see kids doing better in school. We want to increase their access to instruction. We want to reduce crisis situations, not only for our kiddo that is the subject of the BIP, but for the other kiddos around them. We want to support our staff. We don't want to avoid legal violations. Don't get me wrong. That's on the list. But to me, the most important part is the star number one. Let's improve our student outcomes. And at that, I am at 12:30 on the dot. I'm going to turn things over to Ash and have her tell you about the next presentation that we have in store for you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was incredible. You got through all those slides so quickly, so I appreciate that. Um, as you mentioned, the next webinar in the series is what do administrators and providers need to align on? And Stephanie's partner, Cassie, will be leading that, another school attorney, along with someone on our team, Brady Samuel, who has been a superintendent, assistant superintendent, special ed director, and counselor. Interestingly enough, Cassie, who is the lawyer, also has been almost all of those things. I believe she started as a school counselor. Is that correct?
She's a school psychologist and an
Psychologist.
assistant superintendent and a special ed director. Everything but the super. She hasn't been a school superintendent, but everything else. She's pretty
Everything
amazing.
else. So she's had two careers in her life, and they're all going to converge on this one webinar. So if you'd like to save a seat for that, you can go ahead and scan that QR code that's on the page. For CEC, they do offer continuing education credits. If that's something that you're keeping up on, you will receive 1 hour CE credit by attending that live. And so we'll be sending this slide deck out with the recording as well. And so you'll have access to that, and I'll link the webinar to this slide as well. So yeah, we're excited. We hope you join in. We're kind of just going to go even deeper down the web of BIPs. So if you'd like to join us, we'd be happy to have you. Again, I want to thank Stephanie. I want to thank Case and Carrie for hosting this webinar so that we could bring it to all the Case members. And if you guys need anything in terms of services, you know who to reach out to. Carrie, any announcements from Case?
I don't think so, other than I'm so glad so many of you attended. We appreciate that. And thank you to both Stephanie and Luma. It was great content.
Perfect, perfect. Oh, somebody said, can you share a link to the QR code? Yes, I'll put that in the chat really quick here. You know what? I'll send it out in an email. How about that? That'll be easier. I'll send that out in an email for sure. All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much. I hope everybody has a great day, and we'll see you on the next one.
Awesome. Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.